The weirdest part of this whole Remy Ma, Papoose, and Claressa Shields mess is that the paperwork they pushed like a knockout punch may have already lost the fight months before they dragged it back into the spotlight. Everybody keeps arguing about who embarrassed who on the timeline, who shaded who harder, who sounded bitter, who looked pressed. I think that is the wrong conversation. The real conversation is why an old legal threat suddenly became a fresh headline, why the timing lined up so neatly with public promo, and why the one person they were allegedly trying to quiet was still out here performing, posting, and keeping the story alive anyway. That is not just messy celebrity drama. That is a narrative war. That is reputation management. That is public sympathy engineering. And when you really look at the sequence here, Remy Ma, Papoose, and Claressa Shields are not just sitting in a breakup mess anymore. They are sitting inside a media chess match where one side seems to believe a headline can erase momentum, while the other side keeps proving that a headline without follow-through is just noise. And what makes this even crazier is that a lot of people have been treating the cease-and-desist angle like it was the big finishing move, like the paperwork itself was proof that Remy got cornered. No. What I need everybody to understand in the first minute is that paperwork is not power if the target keeps moving like nothing happened. According to Hollywood Unlocked, the cease-and-desist tied to W.Y.F.L was dated April 18th and demanded the record be scrubbed, with the threat of further legal action if it stayed up. But if that document was supposed to stop the motion, then why did the song remain part of the conversation? Why was the record still being discussed publicly? Why was it reportedly still performed later? Why did the public rollout of that threat feel less like the end of a story and more like an attempt to reframe one? See, that is where the whole thing flips. Because the moment everybody is calling a win for Paperwork Pap and his Prizefight Plus podcast alliance is the exact moment I think the trap closes on them. And the deeper layer is the one casual viewers keep missing. This is not just about a marriage ending badly. It is not just about a new relationship getting judged online. It is not even just about one diss record. This is about image control in hip-hop, about who gets to be called the stable one, the honest one, the wronged one, the winner. It is about whether public appearances, carefully worded interviews, and legal-looking pressure can manufacture moral authority. It is about whether the culture still knows the difference between somebody telling their truth and somebody trying to get the headlines to do the heavy lifting for them. And when we get to the part about how this was amplified through interviews, reaction clips, and selective public positioning, you're going to understand why I keep saying this was never only about bars. It was allegedly about silencing the wrong person at exactly the wrong time. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe. Let's get into it. So, let's set the table properly, because if you do not understand the relationships, the timeline, and the stakes, this whole thing just looks like random internet chaos. Remy Ma and Papoose were one of those hip-hop relationships people attached real symbolism to. Not just a couple, but a story. Loyalty. Prison visits. Riding it out. Marriage through the hard years. The kind of narrative the culture loves because it feels bigger than celebrity. Then the public fallout comes, cheating accusations start flying both ways, and suddenly that legacy gets dragged into the middle of live streams, interviews, diss records, and timeline warfare. Now add Claressa Shields, one of the most decorated boxers of her era, into that already explosive mix. The story instantly becomes bigger than a breakup because now it is crossing worlds. Sports media touches it. Gossip media touches it. Hip-hop media touches it. Morning radio touches it. Social media chews it up by the hour. Everybody has a microphone, and every microphone keeps raising the temperature. That is why this matters right now. Musically, it matters because Remy turned emotional fallout into a record and, whether you loved the record or not, she turned pain into product. Culturally, it matters because Papoose had a reputation for years as one of the dependable guys, one of the solid ones, and any public shift in that perception is going to hit people harder than if this were just another random rapper scandal. Financially and reputationally, it matters because Claressa Shields is also a major athlete with endorsements, fight promotion cycles, and a brand built on dominance and focus. Once her name is not just in sports headlines, but in public relationship warfare with a rapper and his estranged wife, every interview becomes riskier and every answer gets dissected. That is not small. That is potentially brand-altering. And for Remy, the stakes are just as serious because if she looks reckless, bitter, or legally vulnerable, people will try to use that to flatten the very thing that made her dangerous in the first place, which is her voice. And that is why I keep telling y'all this is bigger than who clapped back hardest on any given day. The live question is who controls the frame. Who gets to decide whether Remy looks like the woman defending her own narrative or the woman spiraling? Who gets to decide whether Papoose looks like a man trying to move on or a man trying to litigate public perception because the music hit a nerve? Who gets to decide whether Claressa looks like a woman standing firmly in her relationship or a superstar athlete being pulled into a hip-hop mess that keeps overshadowing the actual accomplishments she should be discussing? These are branding stakes. These are legacy stakes. These are audience trust stakes. And in a culture where people form opinions off one screenshot, one blog headline, one clipped quote, the first person to frame the story usually wins unless the evidence starts fighting back. And I think that is exactly what happened here. Because the first layer of tension is obvious. The public-facing version of this situation says Remy crossed a line, Papoose responded, Claressa stood by him, and the grown-up move was legal action. Clean. Simple. Polished. But the second layer, the one that keeps itching at me, is this. If the legal move was so effective, why did the public need to be reminded of it later? Why did the conversation keep returning to Remy's words instead of ending them? Why did so much of the viral energy around this whole triangle keep flowing back to what Remy said, what Remy posted, what Remy performed, what Remy implied? Does everybody understand how important that is? If the target of the smear still owns the narrative gravity, then what exactly got silenced? Let's get into the surface evidence, because this is where the whole polished version starts wobbling. First, Complex reported that Remy Ma released W.Y.F.L around April and made it very clear she was flipping a viral rhythm into a pointed message. They highlighted the bars that seemed aimed at Papoose's old claim that he wrote much of her material, including that line about the nerve of someone claiming they wrote those hits when they never ghostwrote anything for her or anybody else. Now stop right there. That is not vague subliminal smoke. That is Remy going directly at a public narrative Pap had already put into circulation. So when people act like the song appeared out of nowhere, no. The song was part response, part correction, part escalation. Whether you think it was wise or not, it was connected to existing claims already floating around the culture. Second piece of evidence. The same Complex report noted bars widely interpreted as aimed at Claressa Shields, and it also documented that other names in the culture, including Fat Joe, publicly showed support for the record or the moment around it. That matters, because once a diss or a response record gets reposted and celebrated by people with history around the artist, it stops being just personal venting and starts becoming a cultural event. The audience reads cosigns as validation. They read reposts as loyalty signals. They read fire emojis from recognizable names as, oh, this landed. So now the situation is no longer one woman yelling into the void. It is a moment with witnesses. It is a narrative with amplification. It is a conversation the culture is now invited to judge. Third piece of evidence. Hollywood Unlocked later reported on the cease-and-desist itself and said the document was dated April 18th, tying it to the song and demanding removal, while warning of possible defamation action and legal fees. And this is exactly where I need the room to get quiet for a second, because the date is the whole game. If that document was from April, then the later splash around it is not the beginning of the story. It is a reintroduction of the story. That is a giant difference. One version says, we acted immediately and decisively. The other version says, we are resurfacing an older move and letting the public react to it like it is fresh pressure. That does not automatically mean bad faith, so let me be careful. But it absolutely opens the door for analysis about motive, timing, and optics. And this channel exists for exactly that kind of analysis. Fourth piece of evidence. Hollywood Unlocked also said Remy reportedly performed the track at Angie Martinez's barbecue after all this. If that detail is correct, then again, what are we actually talking about? Because a cease and desist can look intimidating on a blog post, but the culture does not judge paper the same way it judges outcomes. If the song is still ringing out in public, if the performance still happens, if the discussion is still alive, then the public reads the move differently. They do not read it as, she got shut down. They read it as, they tried a pressure tactic and the story kept breathing anyway. That is not nothing. In hip-hop, survival is optics. Motion is optics. The appearance of not being rattled is itself a form of power. And then we have the fifth piece of visible evidence, because yes, this story has layers on layers. Vibe documented that after Claressa spoke on The Breakfast Club, Remy hit Instagram stories with that now-circulated message telling the unnamed woman to refrain from speaking, pointing to the age gap, the timing, the kids, and the newly agreed divorce process. That post was not mild. That post was surgical. Then Vibe reported that Claressa replied on X within 45 minutes, saying she was going to say what she wanted, that they were happy, and that yes, they were going to have a family. Now just think about what that means in public perception terms. The athlete trying to defend the relationship is no longer just answering a question in an interview. She is now in direct active back and forth with the estranged wife of the man she loves. That may feel emotionally understandable, but strategically, that is where the clean image starts getting fingerprints all over it. Sixth piece of evidence. The Griot and Complex both reported on Remy's later comments that Papoose was slow-rolling the divorce and that she would even pay to get it finished if money or process was the issue. Again, you do not have to believe every emotional claim made in a breakup war. You should not. But once those remarks are public, they create a new frame. Now Pap is not just defending himself from a diss record, he is also being accused of dragging his feet in formally closing one chapter while publicly living in another. That is a messy visual. One person says the divorce is underway and serious. The other says everything is signed and ready to go and that she wants nothing. Now the audience is not debating one song. They are debating credibility. They are debating consistency. They are debating whether the public image of order actually matches the private mechanics. And I think we need to set the truth on what is actually happening here. The visible evidence keeps telling us the same thing over and over. Every time this situation looks like it is about to become a clean morality tale, another public detail drags it right back into contradiction. Remy drops a record, Pap's side responds with legal language, the record still lives in the conversation, interviews keep happening, social posts keep happening. And the whole thing starts looking less like one party being successfully silenced and more like everybody trying to wrestle the spotlight away from the person who weaponized the mic first. Listen, that is a very different story. And if the visible layer already looks this shaky, what happens when we get to the cultural layer where the reactions, cosigns, and mood shifts start talking back? And oh, do I have more for you? Because if you thought the dates and the posts were enough, wait until you look at how the culture itself kept signaling that the energy around this story was not landing the way the paperwork duo probably wanted it to land. This is the part the villain fans never want to deal with. They want to act like the existence of a legal letter automatically made Remy look finished. No. The next layer is about reactions, subtext, community read, and the little social cues that tell you who actually moved the room. And when we get to the way Claressa's own media appearances kept feeding the story instead of calming it down, some people are really not going to like what that suggests. Because the first big piece of cultural evidence is simple. Claressa herself kept becoming part of the story in rooms where she was not supposed to be the headline. On The Breakfast Club, as cited by Complex and the Griot, she discussed the pending divorce as the elephant in the room and spoke confidently about her relationship with Papoose, saying they were together constantly, on the phone, FaceTiming, in love. Now emotionally, that is her right. But culturally, that kind of answer does two things at once. It reassures her base and inflames the audience already side-eyeing the timing. In other words, instead of shrinking the triangle, it widens it. Instead of reducing Remy's relevance to the narrative, it reinforces Remy's centrality. Every answer about the current relationship is also a reminder of the unfinished previous one. Second piece of cultural evidence. Vibe captured the speed of Claressa's online response to Remy. 45 minutes. That is not somebody floating above the noise. That is somebody still very much inside the noise. And this is where I need to be fair, because some folks will say, why shouldn't she respond? Why should she let another woman keep speaking on her? That is the counter-argument, and it is not crazy. But here is why I think it still collapses. The problem is not that she responded at all. The problem is what the response confirmed. It confirmed emotional investment in the back and forth. It confirmed that the triangle could still be activated with one sharp post. It confirmed that whatever team wanted this to look settled, mature, and under control did not actually have it under control online. Third piece of cultural evidence. The cosign environment around W.Y.F.L mattered more than people want to admit. Complex specifically mentioned support or visible enthusiasm from names like Fat Joe, Memphis Bleak, Murda Mook, Mia X, and Millas around the record. Again, not all support is equal, and fire emojis are not affidavits. I know that. But in hip-hop culture, reaction is currency. It tells the audience whether a moment has heat, whether something is considered a real response, whether peers think a nerve got touched. So while one side tried to make this about decorum and disparagement, the cultural response kept nudging it back toward impact. And impact is dangerous if your whole objective is to minimize the song. Fourth piece of cultural evidence is the rumor ecosystem itself. Complex later covered Claressa pushing back on social media talk about whether Pap spent Christmas with Remy and their daughter, with Claressa insisting he was with his mother and family and not his ex-wife. Now let me tell you why that is important. Once holiday rumor management becomes a public task, the audience no longer sees a clean separation. They see unresolved overlap. They see contested domestic optics. They see a man still legally tied to one chapter while publicly anchored in another. That does not just affect gossip audiences. It affects how every new statement gets interpreted. If you have to keep correcting rumor after rumor, the culture reads instability, not closure. Fifth piece of cultural evidence is even more subtle. Multiple outlets, including Complex, kept returning to one recurring detail. The divorce was filed, but the process was still pending. Claressa repeatedly emphasized that divorce takes time. Remy repeatedly emphasized that everything on her end was signed and ready. Pap emphasized moving forward. Do you hear what that means? The culture is not receiving one coherent story. It is receiving competing narrations about the same process. And in any public scandal, the side that looks most consistent usually benefits. Here, consistency was shaky everywhere except one place. Remy consistently sounded like someone saying, "Stop playing with the public record and stop acting like I am the only one making noise." And sixth, the cultural mood around this story kept rewarding the messiest clips, not the cleanest explanations. The clips that traveled were the clips with tension. The quotes that traveled were the quotes with edge. The moments people kept reposting were not the ones that made the relationship look unbothered and serene. They were the ones that kept dragging Remy back into the room. That matters because it tells you the culture itself was resisting the sanitization effort. The community was not treating this like a settled love story. It was treating it like unfinished business with microphones attached. And when the audience keeps pulling the discussion back to the unresolved center, that is usually a sign the official spin is not winning. Now let me add nuance, because I always want to be honest with y'all. There are people who genuinely feel Remy should have never taken any of this to wax, that once kids are involved and divorce paperwork is active, everybody should shut up and move privately. I get that. I really do. In a perfect world, maybe that is exactly what would happen. But that argument only works if everybody is actually moving privately. Once interviews are happening, once public claims about writing records are happening, once social responses are happening, once relationship details are being discussed in front of cameras, the be private standard cannot be selectively applied only to the woman who rapped back. That is where the moral high ground starts slipping into performance. So here comes the hard pivot, because the real story is not even who said what anymore. The real story is how celebrity conflict gets laundered through media systems until the public forgets to ask the only question that matters: who benefited from framing this like a silencing operation in the first place? This is where we move from tea to machinery. Because once you zoom out, there are at least 3 systemic angles that explain why this story kept getting reheated the way it did. The first angle is media incentive. Outlets do not just report celebrity conflict, they package conflict into episodic engagement. A diss song drops, that is one cycle. A cease-and-desist surfaces, that is another cycle. An interview clip goes viral, that is another cycle. An Instagram story response appears, that is another cycle. A relationship clarification becomes another cycle. The machine rewards continuation. So if you are one of the public figures inside the story, you can start to mistake visibility for victory. But visibility is not always victory. Sometimes visibility just means the machine found a renewable fuel source. The second angle is reputational asymmetry. Remy, Pap, and Claressa do not enter this with the same brand risk. Remy is a rapper. Conflict, bars, and verbal aggression are more native to her public identity. Pap is a rapper too, yes, but his modern-day brand had a heavy layer of respectability attached to it, the loyal husband aura, the composed elder statesman energy. Claressa is an elite athlete whose brand is built on discipline, greatness, and historical achievement. That means the same public moment can cost each of them differently. A diss song may reinforce Remy's identity. A legal threat may make Pap look strategic to some but thin-skinned to others. Repeated involvement in romantic online warfare may cost Claressa more than it costs either rapper because it drags her away from the lane where her excellence is cleanest and least debatable. That is why every public move here had different downside exposure. Third angle, the paperwork itself. In public celebrity culture, documents carry symbolic authority even when the public has no idea what the actual legal outcome was. People see cease-and-desist and immediately assume guilt, fear, danger, shutdown. That is why surfacing such a document can be so powerful as an optics play. It creates a courtroom aura without requiring a courtroom result. It suggests seriousness. It suggests consequence. It suggests we are the adults and you're the reckless one. But if the document does not produce the visible outcome the public expects, then over time it can flip and make the sender look performative. That is why I keep coming back to the date and the aftermath. Because in a system built on headline symbolism, the actual result matters even more than the letterhead. And there is another systemic angle people miss, which is narrative outsourcing. Instead of one principal saying directly, "Here is my position," modern celebrity conflict often gets routed through blogs, repost pages, clipped radio interviews, third-party commentary, and quote aggregation. That allows each person to maintain a certain distance. They can be in the story without always looking like they are pushing the story. But the downside is obvious. Once your narrative is traveling through all these relay points, you lose precision. You gain reach, but you lose control. So a cease and desist intended to make someone look reckless may end up making the sender look shook. An interview meant to normalize a relationship may end up reminding everyone the divorce is still unfinished. An athlete trying to show confidence may end up looking unnecessarily invested in rap gossip combat. The system amplifies everything, including the contradictions. Let's go one layer deeper. Hip-hop has always had a complicated relationship with respectability performance. The culture loves honesty, but it also loves theater. It respects marriage, loyalty, and family, but it also watches every crack in those ideals with obsessive fascination. So if you are Papoose, a man whose public image was built partly on devotion and consistency, the absolute worst thing that can happen in a public breakup is not merely that accusations exist. It is that the audience starts sensing a split between the symbol and the behavior. Once that split happens, every next move gets reread through suspicion. Even reasonable actions get interpreted as cleanup. Even legal actions get interpreted as insecurity. Even silence gets interpreted as strategy. That is a brutal place to be. Now connect that to Claressa. She is used to winning in spaces where the result is definitive. Either you won the fight or you did not. Either the belt is yours or it is not. Celebrity relationship scandal does not work like that. There is no final bell. There is no unanimous decision. There is only rolling public perception. And rolling public perception is one of the few arenas where dominance in another field does not automatically transfer. In fact, it can backfire because the audience expects a champion to rise above pettiness, to keep the main thing the main thing. So when her name keeps getting dragged into timeline warfare, the system does not reward her resume. It flattens her into a character inside somebody else's domestic and musical story. That is why I think this whole situation has been so risky for her brand, whether her fans want to hear that or not. And then there is the platform economy. Podcasts need sound bites. Blogs need updates. Social pages need repostable shade. Audiences need villains and heroes. The machine pressures every participant to keep providing little bursts of conflict, and the person who looks most composed is usually just the person who understands the machine best. This is why Remy's approach, love it or hate it, was so dangerous to the others. She did not only react. She created consumable content. She turned grievance into bars, bars into clips, clips into discourse, discourse into pressure. Once you do that, the other side often feels forced to answer in media-native ways. That is how you get interviews, tweets, quote posts, legal leaks, and all the rest. The machine does not reward the truest side. It rewards the side best able to force the other into unflattering visibility. And that brings me to the most important systemic point of all. Silencing attempts in the social era often function less as true silencing and more as confirmation that the original message landed. If somebody is truly irrelevant, the machine does not need to mobilize around them. If somebody's words truly have no sting, you do not need a whole secondary narrative architecture to contain them. You do not need the cleanup. You do not need the quote wars. You do not need the timing maneuvers. So when I look at this entire arc, what I see is not a woman who got put in her place. I see a woman whose response was treated as important enough to manage. That is a huge difference. Here is the truth bomb, and I want y'all to sit with this before anybody gets emotional in my comments. The plan, at least from where I am sitting, does not look like it failed because no one talked back. It failed because it could not change the emotional center of the story. That is the whole reveal. The alleged effort to smear Remy as reckless, disparaging, and out of control did not stick cleanly because every public attempt to discipline her narrative kept dragging more scrutiny back onto the very people trying to discipline it. The cease-and-desist brought attention back to the song. The interviews brought attention back to the unfinished divorce. The social replies brought attention back to emotional investment. The rumor corrections brought attention back to domestic overlap. Everything circled back. And once that happens, the audience starts asking the question nobody in a polished rollout wants them asking. If Remy was really just ranting into irrelevance, why did so many people keep having to answer her? That is the question that blows the whole thing open. Because the answer cannot simply be, we wanted peace. Peace does not usually look like recurring media participation. Peace does not usually look like repeated public clarifications. Peace does not usually look like legally framed escalation splashed into blogs after the fact. Peace looks boring. This did not look boring. This looked reactive. This looked strategic in parts, emotional in parts, and above all unsuccessful in its core mission, which was allegedly to make the public stop centering Remy's voice. And the consequences of that are bigger than one beef cycle. For Pap, it means the old unshakable image is now permanently in negotiation with a newer image that many people find far messier. For Claressa, it means every time she steps into this triangle publicly, she risks lending her champion status to a story she still cannot control. For the media ecosystem, it means once again we watched a legal-looking move generate more gossip oxygen instead of less. And for the audience, it means the culture is still smart enough, at least sometimes, to notice when silencing is really just another way of saying, we could not get ahead of the conversation the organic way. What I think is happening here is that Remy understood something before the others did. She understood that if you tell your side through a record, you do not just make a statement. You create a replayable artifact. An interview clip comes and goes. A tweet comes and goes. A post expires. But a song sits there. It can be reposted, quoted, performed, debated, reinterpreted. It can keep living long after the outrage cycle moves on. So even if every single person around her tried to box her into the role of the bitter ex, she still had the one thing that culture respects most when it is done effectively: product. That is why the attempted smear could not fully erase her. She did not just complain. She turned the complaint into content. And that is why the hero resolution here is actually pretty simple. The right person did not win because the internet suddenly got moral. Please. The internet is never that noble. The right person is still standing because discipline in this context meant controlling the center of gravity. Remy made the culture come back to her voice. She made them answer her claims, answer her tone, answer her timing, answer her record, answer her posts. Even people who disagreed with her had to go through her. That is power. Messy power, yes. Imperfect power, absolutely. But power all the same. Meanwhile, look at the contrast. One person made a diss record that forced conversation. The other side made responses that kept proving the conversation had to happen. One person used bars to create pressure. The other side used interviews, posts, and paperwork to manage pressure. One person looked like she was fighting from the center of her own lane. The others kept getting dragged onto terrain that made them look either reactive, conflicted, or overexposed. That is the whole story in one line. While the paperwork duo were trying to engineer perception, Remy kept making herself impossible to route around. Listen, I am not telling you Remy handled every part of this like some flawless saint. That is not my argument. My argument is that in a story about smear, silence, and spin, the person who still sounds most like herself by the end usually comes out stronger than the people who sound like they are workshop testing public sympathy. And every major beat we walked through points back to that. The record landed. The support surfaced. The document date complicated the narrative. The public responses kept the triangle alive. The divorce chatter stayed unresolved. The audience never truly stopped centering Remy. That is why I keep saying the right person is still winning. Not because the situation is pretty, but because the evidence never fully left her side of the board. So yes, this is only the start, and I mean that in a very specific way. The next two developments to watch are obvious. First, whether this divorce situation ever actually reaches the kind of finality everybody keeps talking about, but nobody seems able to present cleanly. Until that happens, every public statement from every side is going to keep getting filtered through the same unresolved question. Second, watch how the media strategy shifts. Do we get more interviews, more relationship framing, more indirect corrections, more carefully timed leaks? Or does everybody suddenly decide silence is golden now that the audience has started reading between the lines? Because that answer is going to tell us who learned the right lesson from this mess and who is still performing for the wrong scoreboard. And if you made it all the way here, you already know why you need to stay locked in, because stories like this never end where people think they do. They end when the paperwork matches the public talk, when the image matches the behavior, and when the culture stops needing subtitles to understand who is really moving from truth and who is moving from optics. Until then, expect more tension, more screenshots, more quote-worthy moments, and more people pretending to be unbothered while answering questions nobody asked them to answer. So keep your eyes open, keep your ears open, and stay subscribed, because the next video needs to be the one about how hip-hop's most clean public narratives keep collapsing the second the timelines, documents, and interviews stop agreeing with each other. That one is going to be nasty, layered, and very, very hard for certain people to dodge.